Today I want to share with you guys my easy guide to making a homemade sourdough starter from scratch. Starting your own sourdough starter is actually really simple. I know a lot of times the sourdough starter can feel either really scientific and technical, or it can just feel like put some water and flour in a jar and it's going to be perfect. I'm hoping this video will be the perfect middle ground for you and give you enough information to make a really good and successful starter, but not too much to where you feel like it's overly complicated. I've made sourdough starters several times before, so know that you can eyeball it, but in this video I will give you measurements in grams and show you how to use a digital scale the easiest way possible, and it makes it a lot more accurate. A lot of guesswork gets taken out when you use a digital scale, so I'm going to show you guys how I do mine, how you can really easily do it as a beginner. So get excited because I think you're gonna have great success with this method. I'll leave you some timestamps down below this video. That way, if you want to revisit it as you're on different days, you can come back to this video and kind of assess where you're at, as well as leave a link to my written instructions. I have a whole written out guide that you can even print off over on my website, so I'll link that down below. Since you're probably new to sourdough and you're gonna get your sourdough starter all bubbly and beautiful like this one, you're gonna wanna bake bread with it as soon as possible, I'm pretty sure. So I'm gonna leave two different recipes down below. I have one that I've shared in a video before, so I'll link it in the cards. It's my step-by-step guide to making a few of my favorite different recipes, but it is a little bit more advanced, and that's from hearing back from you guys, your experience working with it. So if you are brand new, I'm gonna suggest you try a new recipe of mine that is just my easy beginner sourdough crusty bread recipe. It's a lower hydration dough. That means it's less wet and it's easier to work with. Then you can move on to higher hydration sourdough bread. So it's a little bit trickier to work with. You have to wet your hands more. If you're a beginner, I totally hear you. I totally understand. Definitely try my easy sourdough bowl recipe. It's just a really nice crusty loaf. This is a piece we have left over. As soon as I make bread, my bread is gone. My family of 6 devours this in no time. So I usually make 2 at a time. I make enough sourdough starter to make 2 of those at a time. And this is that crusty, easy beginner sourdough bread. So you can see I have about a 4-inch rise on it just from my sourdough starter. It has a nice crusty exterior, but the inside is just as light as air, and it has that closed crumb. Versus my sourdough crusty bowl that is a higher hydration dough will have lots of little air pockets in here and just a slightly chewier texture. So depending on where you're at in your journey, you can check out one of those recipes. I'll leave them both linked down below. And I know from previous experience, you guys are usually looking for some tools to learn how to make sourdough easier. So I'll leave kind of like my sourdough toolkit down below in the description box as well, so that you guys feel like you have all the tools you need to take on making sourdough. As far as a recipe goes for making sourdough starters, it's really simple. There's only 3 ingredients. You're gonna want water and flour, and today I'm gonna use a combination of all-purpose and whole wheat, which I'll tell you more about in just a bit. But I'm sure if you're new to sourdough and you're just finding this video, you might be wondering, what is a sourdough starter? Making your own sourdough starter begins with creating a culture simply from flour and water. There are wild yeast and bacteria in the flour and in the air and even on our hands. And so by adding water to that and letting it ferment at room temperature, we're just kind of cultivating a yeast and this wild culture, which then begins to rise and fall predictably. That way we can use it to rise and make this amazing sourdough bread and sourdough baked goods. I bake with mine a couple times a week, but I don't like to feed it all the time. The method I'm showing you today, you'll be able to feed it once and then keep it in the fridge for really easy maintenance. There's not a ton of discard after you get your starter established, so it's really good for beginners or even advanced sourdough people, as my daughter says. This is just a great method. This is personally what I do, but I do end up just eyeballing my sourdough starter after it's established. So you'll be able to feed it as much as you like or as little as you like, and then just keep it in the fridge and pull it out whenever you need it. So let's get started.
Let's begin by going over some useful tools and the ingredients you'll need to make your starter. You'll want 2 glass jars with loose fitting lids. I like to use Weck jars number 743. You'll want ample room for your starter to be able to rise, and a loose lid so that fermentation gases have room to escape. A wooden spoon or spurtle. I love spurtles because you can easily scrape down the sides of your jar to keep it clean. room temperature filtered water that doesn't have any chlorine in it. And for general sourdough bread making, I always use a digital scale because it's easier than measuring in cups and is also more accurate. You'll want to include whole wheat flour even if you will regularly be feeding it all purpose like I do, because we want that outer coating of the wheat that all purpose doesn't have. I like to use my Nutri-Mill to grind my own whole wheat, but store-bought works just as well. You can also use 100% rye flour instead of whole wheat. You'll also want some organic, unbleached all-purpose flour or unbleached bread flour. To begin making our sourdough starter culture, I'll turn on my scale and change the unit to grams. Then I'll place my jar on and tare the scale to 0, which just means to zero out the weight of whatever was already on the scale. It should read 0 grams, and now for day 1, I'll add 50 grams of whole wheat flour, followed by 50 grams of all-purpose flour. If you ever sprinkle in a little bit too much flour by accident, don't worry. Just use your hands or a spoon and you can just pull a little bit out. I do it all the time. And your measurements also don't have to be exactly perfect. If it's 1 or 2 grams over or under, there's not going to be an issue at all, so don't even worry about it. I'll press tare again to bring the scale to 0 grams, and then I'll add in about 150 grams of room temperature water. Then remove the jar from the scale. You can turn the scale off now, and I put my jar back on the table. That way I don't ruin the scale's calibration when I'm stirring it. And then I like to give it a nice good stir. Give it a little muscle and make sure that there are no clumps of flour left. And if you notice the consistency that the starter is today on day 1, this is the thinnest your starter will ever be. As we go on day by day, it's going to get thicker and thicker, and our regular feeding that we'll do after day 7 until the end of time will be a lot thicker than this, thicker than a pancake batter. So it should never be any thinner than this. It should end up a very thick consistency at the end. Now I'll loosely place the lid on the jar, and you can label what day it is and what time you started the culture. I like to use a little bit of craft tape, and we'll place this jar in a dark, warm spot in the kitchen and let it ferment at room temperature for 24 hours. Each time I'm feeding a small amount of starter with flour and water, I am discarding from the bigger amount that I got that starter from. And the reason we have to do a little bit of discard from starters is because it's necessary or it becomes over fermented. Once your starter is established, you can save it and use it in a sourdough discard recipe like pancakes. But when creating your starter, you definitely want to discard, and especially the liquid component that sits on top, which is called hooch. After 24 hours, we're on to day 2, and the process for days 2 and 3 is exactly the same. I'll get a clean, fresh jar, place it on the scale, and tare it to 0. Then I'll add in 70 grams of our leftover sourdough starter that we started yesterday, along with 50 grams of whole wheat flour. And before you add in your sourdough starter, you can scrape some off the top and make sure that any liquid that was on there is thrown into the garbage and not put into the fresh starter. Now I'll add in 50 grams of all-purpose flour. And when you're adding in your flour, you can either tare it to 0 in between adding your whole wheat and all-purpose, or you can just add 50 grams plus another 50 grams and end up at 100. We'll reduce the amount of water that we used on day 1 for days 2 and 3 by adding 115 grams of room temperature water. Again, you'll remove the jar from the scale, then give everything a really good stir. Then place the lid on your jar loosely and leave that on the counter to ferment for another 24 hours. And then at the beginning of day 3, you'll repeat it. You probably get the picture by now. And by the end of day 3, your starter might look something just like this. You can see there are bubbles all over the top of it, and it has started to rise. Now Now for days 4 and 5, we're going to do the exact same process, but we're bringing down the amount of water again from 115 grams now to 100 grams. And by the end of day 5, your starter is going to look something like this. You should be seeing active bubbling, and it should have risen about doubled in size, but it's not quite ready yet. You want to keep feeding it and developing a strong starter so that when you go to make bread for the first time, you can get a nice rise out of it. The cooler your house is, the longer it'll take your starter to rise, and the warmer your house is, the quicker it'll rise. And about on day 5 is when I like to either use tape or a rubber band around the bottom to mark where my starter begins after I feed it and where it ends up to see if it's doubled in size. And you can also see how it's gradually getting thicker and thicker. This is perfect. Now we're on day 6, and we're going to do things just a little bit different by reducing the amount of starter we're using from 70 grams all the way down to 50 grams of sourdough starter. Then I'll tare the scale and I'll add in 50 grams of whole wheat flour, and 50 grams of all-purpose flour. Then I'll pour in 100 grams of room temperature water. At this point, your starter should start to smell like a mild yogurt. If it smells strong like vinegar, then you need to keep feeding it for a few days until it's kind of mellowed out a bit. If you happen to start your starter at night and it's rising overnight while you're sleeping, you might miss how tall it rises. But a good way to be able to tell how tall it got is the streaks on the side of the jar when your starter starts to fall. So it'll rise and then it'll start to fall. And just when it starts to fall, it's the perfect time to bake with, and it's ready for more food at that point. As your starter continues to mature, it will begin to rise faster than it does now, and it will also develop more and more flavor, so just keep cultivating those yeasts. Now we're on to day 7, and day 7 is also your maintenance feeding, meaning that once your starter is active, you'll only need to perform this feeding once a week in order to keep your starter healthy. And then you can keep it in the fridge and only have to pull it out once a week, or you can pull it out more often whenever you want to bake with it. It makes it super easy to maintain it. So day 7, we're changing our ratios again, and this is how I normally feed my starter. So I'll do 35 grams of my active sourdough starter and then 140 grams of all-purpose flour. So we're not going to use any whole grain flour. You could if you wanted, but I typically feed mine with just regular all-purpose flour. And then I'll add in 140 grams of water. So we're doing 140 grams to 140 grams of flour and water, so just equal parts. And you can either scale this down or scale this up depending on how much you need for whatever you plan on baking. I like to feed it with this amount because I know it's going to fill up my jar and give me enough to make my 2 loaves of bread that I like making. So you can kind of play around with the amounts and make sure that you have enough starter for whatever your favorite recipes are. The more you feed it, the more it's going to want to eat. So if you don't bake with it that frequently, I suggest keeping it more to a standard smaller amount like I'm showing you here. You can keep doing this day 7 feeding over and over until you feel like your starter is strong enough. And I'm going to show you a quick way to test whether your starter is ready. It's called the float test. So you'll get a glass of water and then you'll just take a scoop of your sourdough starter after it's risen and is bubbly. And if it floats, it is ready to be baked with. If you add in your starter and it sinks to the bottom, that is not ready to bake with. So keep on feeding it, wait 12 hours, and then feed it again.
This is my sourdough starter right here. All I do is I'll pull it out of the fridge, I'll leave it on the counter for a couple of hours just to come to room temperature, and then I'll feed it and it'll rise all day usually, and then it'll be ready to bake with as soon as it's risen and doubled in size. And then after I use the starter that I needed from it, I'll just pop my lid on. I like to use one of my loose fitting lids, and I'll put it in the fridge, and it's as simple as that. I hope you guys enjoyed today's step-by-step guide, and if your sourdough starter turns out well or you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I'll be happy to help you guys out however I can. If you feel like you're ready to take on bread making that's still really simplified, then you can check out my other video, my easy step-by-step guide to making the best foolproof sourdough breads, and check out the other videos on my sourdough playlist.